I'm Keith.
And I'm Emmeline, and you're listening to the Creative Education Podcast.
Joining us today is Jessica Argo.
Jess is the Programme Leader of Sound for the Moving Image at Glasgow School of Art.
Well, hi Jess, thank you very much for joining us and coming to talk to us tonight and tell us a bit about yourself and be a part of our podcast. So I wonder if you want to get going and you could just introduce yourself.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do?
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to meet you, Keith, and it's great to see you again, Emmeline. I am one of Emmeline's friends from childhood. And we've played music together for years. We used to play in a string quartet. That was our bread and butter as we were going through uni. So that's ancient history maybe, but more recently I work as the programme leader for the BDES Sound for Moving Image course at Glasgow School of Art. But before that was set up, I've been teaching on master's courses at the art school as well, the Master's Sound Design for Moving Image, but also cross-school electives in sound culture for art, architecture, graphic design students. All sorts of students would join my elective. So that's my primary role. I was trained as an artist, believe it or not, in painting, drawing and painting first, but I, since childhood, have been really fascinated by the potential for music to move me emotionally, as well as dance, basically lots of performative art forms. In fact, Emmeline and I would play in symphony orchestras growing up as well. And yeah, we just loved playing like really fierce classical music or film soundtracks, all sorts, on our cello and on our violin. So yeah, that fed into my work as an artist. And before I learned how to make sound for moving image at GSA, I made live installations in nightclubs, white cube gallery spaces, live in situ performances in strange acoustic spaces across the world.
So it's an absolutely, it's really interesting because my background's a visual arts degree as well. It's a graphic design degree that I did, and now obviously I work in music, and I think that's really interesting, that idea of tying in the visual and the audio, and it must be something that's more common among artists from either side to delve into the other one. I think it's really informative that in the same way that fashions are informed by all sorts of things, that the arts sort of inform each other, and that's kind of why they're so important, because as well as informing life generally, they all feed into each other in this kind of cross-curricular way.
Yep, I found that after a year or two of making static works, whether it was prints or paintings on canvas or photographs, I loved doing that, but I also just felt like there was something that was missing. And yeah, when I accessed some of the cameras in the department and managed to get a hand-me-down of a DSLR camera, it allowed me to make short movies that looked like my paintings, but they also sparked music in my head when I was watching these movies that might be like lights moving across a scene, or movement patterns of people going through gallery spaces, all this kind of thing. And I thought, well, these are like moving paintings and they might act as graphic scores, because, me and Emmeline were trained in sort of associated board, Western stave notation. And I felt really self-conscious improvising beyond the score. So I used moving image as my kind of score at first, and then just continued making bizarre sounds all by myself since then.
So what did those bizarre sounds grow into? If you talk us through some of what you would have done with a sound installation before, or a sound and visual installation.
Okay, yeah. So Yeah, at first, when I was making these moving images sequences, and I would maybe take my cello or use the piano that was at the student union and sort of plonk away and make sounds that mimicked forms in these videos. But then I also thought, well, I love dance music, and at the time in 2010, I loved dubstep and hip hop, and well, still love things like Beyonce, for example. And I just thought, well, I often see images when I listen to those musics, so why don't I stage parties that I can project images that I've conjured up myself? So I made these kind of animations that were synchronized to songs that I loved to dance to. And then somewhere in the middle, I decided, well, very gratefully collaborated with friends who put on club nights with bigger musicians like Max Cooper and minimal techno musicians like Fabrizio Morizzi. And so I made visuals and mixed them live for their music. But then I also thought, well, maybe I can try and find the best of both worlds, that I could take samples of music that I like and manipulate that live and try and just do everything, being a bit of a control freak.
That's a creative brain thing, though, isn't it? That control freak thing where you need to have every aspect of that creative process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, before I went and studied at the Glasgow School of Art, and learned how to make synthesized sounds myself, that kind of thing, I would take samples from film scores or trip hop music, all this kind of thing, and just sort of arrange them into new beats that seem to make sense with my visuals.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you're saying, Jess, about taking the visuals that were in your mind and putting them with the music. And it makes me wonder, did you have feedback from other people? Was that sort of images that were going through their mind as well? Or do you think it is a really subjective sort of thing?
Well, I would have loved to at the time, like, give people surveys in the dance clubs and things like that.
Here you go.
Yeah, I think what the best I could do, I felt like at that time, because I was already doing so much at the event, was I asked people to photograph and film people's immediate responses to those visuals and the sounds. So my kind of feedback that I got back then was like, if I had, for example, sort of strobing black and white lines, and I saw people like lining their bodies up to the visuals, I saw that as like feedback that they were looking at that as almost a graphic score to dance, or that they were being excited by the visuals changing, and
that it resonated with them.
Yes,
yeah,
I can move with this.
But yeah, I would have loved to have been able to do an experiment where I asked people to listen to a song and then like jot down what they see in their heads. But in a way, I do that quite a lot when I'm teaching, like with some of the trying to think outside the box and have like noise making sessions with my students and ask them to visualize a sound. Like when I'm trying to sort of ease them into experimental filmmaking and video art. And yeah, we use Padlets to let them just draw in a second or two or like a minute what they think like this kind of sound. Do I have something to chime this with? I get them to draw what this sounds, what that kind of sounds like to them, and so they generally have this kind of consensus that the sound is circular and it radiates out. Yeah. So there are ways that I'm trying to like find out consensuses of what images are triggered by sounds in my students.
That idea of pulling in what you've done previously and how you use your own creativity to then teach others to be creative is really interesting. And I think that is something that for someone working in teaching at any level, could be really useful. And so I did really want to ask you how your own creativity informs how you teach and how you use that to change how you would teach.
Well, yeah, no, I think we've all had to be a lot more creative in our teaching in the last
definitely.
few months. Like, given that we can't be in a room in front of people anymore, or we can't sort of walk them through a gallery exhibit, or just have that relation to, what we're talking about on the blackboard and seeing their faces in front of us. So yeah, for sure, we've all had to be creative just in the way that we deliver some of the content to students, but also maybe this sort of difference between like delivery and the odd Q&A, rather having the sessions actually being much more sort of interactive and connected throughout, like having some of the delivery that they can view like pre-recorded, or read the transcripts and that they can access in their own time, rather than being all sat in front of me and quietly paying attention, that kind of thing. And then having an hour-long discussion afterwards. Rather, we've had to make sure that there's no tumbleweeds on a Zoom session for an interactive seminar, and have these kind of playful interludes perhaps, or these playful workshops that don't just put pressure on the students to feel like they've fully understood everything, rather that we try and get these understandings together.
So do you find that to be more productive or less productive than what was happening before? Is it a blessing in disguise, or has it been really hard to adapt to?
Well, I think, of course, it is, in terms of time, it's like double the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Nearly, yes. So, it'd be nice to get more sleep, but of course, I'm just delighted that students are responding well to it, and that I'm also feeling like there's a widening of accessibility, both in terms of like my comfort in that for some reason I must be like one of the only teachers that actually prefers to pre-record presentation content and speak to no one. And just have that kind of comfortable space where I can control what's being delivered, or I can pause, I can repeat things, or adjust them to my own pace, basically. And then I think students feel like it's more accessible, that they can watch a lecture and they can pause it and they can read the subtitles and
think about it, reflect.
If I think about my time at uni, and I'm dyslexic, I used to find lectures really difficult because I couldn't write at the speed that they were being lectured at, essentially. And so that for me, if I was back at uni now and I could watch that before the discussion, I would be so much more involved in the discussion than I ever could have been before, because I've been too busy trying to keep up with the notes, trying to even get everything that I needed onto the page at all to be able to be in the discussion.
Yeah, and I feel that there's much more meaningful ways of engaging with that material as well. Like, rather than, it's not a test to see who can write verbatim what the teacher has said. Like, of course, taking your own notes, like directed and summarized notes, can help processing and help it sort of stay in your memory a bit more. But, we've got the technology to do these capturings and these transcriptions within seconds. It's bizarre and uncanny how quickly that we can generate that now, so why make it like a test to see who's the fastest at writing notes? Rather, the meaningful tasks and ways of engaging with that can be to set them a question to try and answer in that discussion session, and give them some time to prepare and write a wee response in advance, and sometimes watch content together. But like, when I say content, I maybe mean a piece of music or a clip from a film. I don't mean watch this spiel that I'm delivering to a class, No,
I can completely relate to that as well. It was always, when I studied music, the practical workshops that I enjoyed much more than the lectures, the ones where we're all making music together. Or, I did a lot of improvising and played in the Edinburgh Composers Orchestra, and it was all very, that's what made me come alive and become engaged, and that's made me start thinking as well. Yes, it's just making me think about, have you done, explorations of sound and music online with your students?
Well, within the curriculum, the wider curriculum, we have, some important historical, like political kind of an art movement content to get through, without making it sort of too stale or like they're just reading a history textbook. But it's really important for them to get that, like, everyone up to speed on like the milestone events that inspired radical art not just radical art movements, but avant-garde practices within the last 100 years or so. And then when it comes to teaching the studio components of the course, I've, for example, used to in person sort of take people on a sound walk of Glasgow, where we would sometimes walk in silence, but trying to get everyone to stay quiet and attentive to the sound for the entire time is difficult. But we'd all walk around with recorders and capture the soundscape around us and discuss, like, how much of it is man-made, how much of this is wildlife, how much of it is weather sounds, those kind of applying some of the theories of like acoustic ecologists to our own practice. And then, I've had to think, well, students can still do that, but they're just going to have to do it alone and in their own environments, whether that's in the home, whether that's in their local neighborhood, or whether they do feel like they can cycle into town and maybe get a city soundscape. But it's all about, making sure that they choose the path that's safe for them at the moment.
It's a really interesting little project, actually, and is completely a project that even at a primary school level you could go out and do and have a really meaningful discussion about afterwards.
Yes. And I think it's about bringing awareness, isn't it, to the sounds around you as well, things that often go unnoticed, the cars or the birds, and especially when everybody's busy and rushing around, it's just bringing your awareness to the different sounds and musics around you.
And all these things that we've been missing while we've all been locked up at home as well, which is really interesting. That idea of if you went for a walk during the sort of height of lockdown and how different those sounds were than they are again now that everyone's back to moving around. It was vastly, vastly different in terms of man-made versus natural.
I've got lots more detail, obviously, about that project, but it was certainly inspired by inclusive practitioners like Jacqueline Waldock, for example, who, many of the Women in Sound and Women on Sound organisation are really keen to try and get children to do these kind of projects, to hold a small handheld recorder, because, they'll have really interesting perspectives. And of course, sometimes they might, of course, there's the risk of them dropping it or, fumbling with the microphone, that kind of thing. But they've even developed strategies like, knitted little character puppets to go around the recorders, or even if they're too young for holding recorders, you can even just give them an ear cup, which is like a little sort of a signal that, no, I'm listening to this sound now, or attach the microphone to their body. So you can read about this online, Jacqueline Waldock's text sound mapping. It's publicly available, and
we'll include some links as well for people to check out, which I think would
definitely.
be great. The other thing that I found was really, really interesting when I, because obviously I don't know you as well as Emmeline does, so I went away and did my research, and the other stuff that really, really interested me was the stuff that you explored when you did your TED Talk. So I wondered if you would, for the listener, just talk us through a little bit of what that was and what that process was.
Sure, yeah, of course. So I did a PhD for 3 years because I wanted, exactly like Emmeline was saying, I wanted to try and understand whether things that were going on in my head were unique to me, or whether there were some images that might be conjured by sounds, but rather than just necessarily like graphic animations or synesthetic kind of Fantasia-esque visuals. I'm maybe speaking more about semantic associations or memories, or like whether sounds could act as a trigger for a different emotion, maybe. So so I just really wanted to be able to quantify emotional and physical affects of sound. And I was working with sound alone, actually. I completely took a 180 from starting off with drawing and painting and visual artwork, and I just worked with sound alone for that PhD. Because obviously when you're trying to conjure up personalized memories for people, if you have an image, even if it was just of a sort of general cityscape, that would actually get in the way of people's...
Yeah, you're colouring their opinion before you start, aren't you? Mm-hmm. You're giving them a stimulus before you've begun.
Yeah, and I figured that, I wanted to work with spatial sound as well, and specifically in a 16-speaker ambisonic array. And I figured that I could layer up sounds in a way that was not necessarily tied to a visual situation or a colour scheme, that kind of thing. I could layer sounds in a really sort of hallucinatory, imaginative way, if it was just sound alone. But the whole reason for this, rather than just wanting to continue working in spatial audio and get some sense of data about what I was doing to people, was that I was really fascinated by music therapy and the paradigms of what existed. Exposure therapy as well, like visual virtual reality, or in vivo exposure therapy, tended to be a lot about either like real life situations or a visualization or talking through situations. And then music therapy has some amazing applications for like bringing joy into people's lives and like letting them express sometimes difficult emotions through playing an instrument, through like active participation. So I was aware of like what existed in the field for using music to help people emotionally. And I thought, of course, it's pretty risky and maybe much more difficult to find a good balance, but there was less use of sound for exposure therapy. Usually if sound was used as a form of therapy, it would be for empowerment and positive associations or catharsis sometimes, for example, palliative care patients, that kind of thing. So there was that middle ground that I just felt like hadn't really been covered in depth that much, using challenging sounds to let people practice feeling anxiety in a safe environment, because I think a lot of people just think, well, that just verges on sonic torture.
Torture, yes. I was going to say, but I'd let you say it before I said it, yeah.
No, well, I acknowledge it. Like you've got to be so careful and considered, and you've got to make sure that people give consent and they know roughly what's going to be played, and make sure that you've got to align to World Health Organization levels of decibels, and of course the sounds I produced, I think they were quite realistic at times, they were quite musical at times, but they were never necessarily intended just to be just abrasive and just horrible and just deafening. That would just actually be ineffective after a minute or two, obviously, but you've got to sort of gently sort of guide people through these emotions in what's maybe more of a meditative manner than just blasting sound in a sonic torture.
Yeah,
that's what I was keen to do.
It's supposed to be helpful in the end rather than torturous.
Yeah. So I think some people were surprised by how quiet some of the soundscapes were. Certainly one of my colleagues said, "That's not loud enough at all." And I was like, well, I want the sounds to be quite realistic. I don't want it to sound like it's amplified.
Yeah.
So what kind of sounds, for instance, if you talk us through if you choose one and talk us through a couple of the sounds that you were exposing people to within that.
Well, I chose like 5 archetypes of different kinds of anxiety that I thought could be represented through sounds. And I think one that seemed to be like representative of all of the works was one specifically based on body anxieties. Because obviously the sensations of anxiety quite often are related to like a regular heartbeat, feeling sweaty, not being able to breathe in a sort of calm way. So yeah, I started off that soundscape with a collection of breath sounds that, you know, erred from quite naturalistic to sounding like they were in a spacesuit, for example, or blowing up a balloon, lots of kind of hyperbolic representations of that sound, as well as, you know, really quiet heartbeats that were basically only audible on headphones or in that ambisonic array. And so that's how it started, with all of these kind of internal bodily sounds. And then it sort of shifted into slightly more, you know, contentious, visceral sounds like sort of rubbing of skin or scratching, and, you know, those kind of bodily sounds that people don't like to overhear, or knuckles cracking. And I don't think I actually included nails on a chalkboard, because that's maybe just
a step too far.
Yeah, it's the quintessential horrible sound. But yeah, that was actually it gradually got a bit more literal and sort of ended up in a suite of hospital sounds that I don't know if I can really listen to these days, actually, because of other life experiences. But those hospital sounds were also introduced in a kind of musique concrète manner, in that they were sort of ripped of their original structure and sort of arranged as different rhythms. So it didn't necessarily sound very realistic. It didn't sound like if you closed your eyes, you were in a hospital scene, but it was sort of meant to go from like internal worries to catastrophizing, basically. But if it makes you feel better, in the middle of that soundscape, there was a relaxing water sequence, a liquid sequence.
Just to put them at ease before you know, bigged it up a little bit later again.
Yeah, no, that was one of the moments that it was really interesting to see the people's sort of change in physiological responses. So if
I understand it correctly, the people that agreed to take part in the study for you had a kind of device that would measure how much they sweat and what their heart rate was, and so that you could see in real time, essentially, which sounds were the triggers for that person. Yeah,
so I strapped them into honest, it wasn't sonic torture. They had a respiration belt, so that was around their ribs, and more than trying to sort of see, you know, accelerations or decelerations in breath, I was more tracking for gasps or moments they forgot to breathe, anomalies essentially. And then on their finger they had a galvanic skin response or a sweat secretion monitor, and again, that wasn't so much trying to gather if they were dripping in sweat, like they were running or anything like that. It's more, it tracks minute changes in the salt content of the skin. So if people are perhaps shocked or having a feeling of bliss or something that is a novel kind of strong sensation, it's hard to pin down exactly what that was without tying it to their written subjective responses, which I did at times. But yeah, essentially that would capture a sweat secretion peak. And then on their earlobe, there was a pulse monitor. But I'll be honest, that data was really difficult to normalize, because if you're trying to monitor someone's heart, you're ideally meant to have a cardiogram, which is very expensive. I just had a pulse monitor. So I focused more on those peaks in the skin and the respiration anomalies. And of course, the wealth of responses from people's questionnaires that they filled in after each soundscape and before and after the session.
So before we talk a little bit about what those responses were and how that moved into, what they gained from that, maybe we can let everyone have a little bit of a listen, and we'll maybe warn them not to drive their car at the same time, and we'll see how the listener responds to the kind of things that you're talking about. Because I know certainly for myself and for Emmeline, who have both listened, it's quite a reaction. You can feel the hair on your neck change, or the sweat on your hands, like you're talking about. If you're aware of your own reaction, you'll notice it.
Yeah, the body anxiety one that we've been speaking about, obviously I've mentioned that trigger there of the hospital sound, so be aware that's at the end. But the opening section with the internal bodily sounds and going into the more visceral, unpleasant sounds could be a point to listen to. Or if you want to treat yourself, maybe the water sequence that's in the middle.
Yeah.
But note as well, like that soundscape doesn't have any traditional musical instruments in that. Rather, it's using sounds as musical timbres. Whereas if people are keen to listen to one with piano, cello and voice, that one is the violence soundscape.
So now that we all have a bit more of an idea about how it felt to go through that, can you talk us through a little bit of how your participants felt and what they got out of it too?
In general, obviously I ran a pilot with people that I was more familiar with, and we sort of tested that out. And I wouldn't have carried on with a big experiment without making sure that the experiment environment was comfortable and that people felt supported. And even from the initial recruitment stage, people had helplines to speak to if even the information sheet was unsettling for them. So just to know that like each participant was it was ensured that they weren't going through an acute experience of distress at that time, whether it was essentially they needed to score below a certain score on the eligibility criteria to begin with, to ensure that it was safe for all. And I wasn't looking for maximum fear and people running out of the sound lab. Of course, that would have been way too strong for that kind of thing. But I think a lot of participants were surprised that sounds that hadn't even been a part of their formative and anxious experiences, sounds like, for example, forest fires, or again, like those ambiguous kind of humming sounds or croaking of different animals that can't be distinguished, that they at times, like one participant burst into tears and they didn't know why, but they also said it wasn't like sad tears, it was just that they were
just a big emotion,
overwhelmed.
Whereas for example, with the hospital sounds mentioned there's a participant who re-experienced a feeling of grief from when a relative of theirs, they would visit them in the hospital. But unlike any of their experiences in talking therapy, where they felt kind of on the spot and under pressure to vocalize those experiences and make sense of them, Rather, they were given space to just feel those feelings again, and and they said that it was a warm feeling of grief, which they didn't quite understand. But then, and there was also some specific reactions to the spatializations of sound as well. Like, for example, the sound of I think a goose croaking. One participant said it felt like that was within their own chest, even though it was, I think, above them or below them. I can't quite remember. There was some common sounds, like some sounds that commonly induced anxiety, like the flying sounds, like the sounds inside an airplane or airplanes whizzing by. All of the sort of changes in engine sounds, and of course, induction of alarms and layering with alarms, it sort of signified what could go wrong with all of the fears of flying. So there's a specific example in my thesis looking at how one participant just said that was every sound that they would imagine in when they have the fear of flying, like being played out to them in a way that, again, it was quite uncanny because it wasn't quite like narratively realistic either. It was just sort of a hyper imagining of it. But on the whole, if I can remember right, statistically, there were 4 participants who felt like they'd managed to overcome a feeling of underlying fear, trauma, or grief out of 30. There were several participants who felt like they were more able to withstand anxious sensations after the soundscape experience. Some participants, I was taking tears or crying to be a sign of catharsis, and some cried within the sound lab, some cried in the week following the sound lab. So I had a week-long catharsis questionnaire.
I mean, there's a quote that initially I'd pulled from your website, I think, but it's along the topic that you're talking about. So often talking to people about themes of grief can involve judgment, whereas with sound that's absent, which makes it easier or safer. So did you find that, I presume that's taken from a participant, or did you find that people find that without the judgment factor as such, it was a process that they valued?
Well, I was quite surprised by these strangers that I recruited, knowing that I wasn't a therapist, knowing that I wasn't anything other than an artist who was doing a PhD and had affiliation with the GSA. After listening to a soundscape, they had a questionnaire to fill out, but they also, from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, some of them would just go into this, I can't believe that reminded me of this, and they couldn't help but tell me what they'd imagined or what they'd remembered. And it was quite striking, the openness.
It's powerful, absolutely powerful.
Responses.
And for me, in a positive way too, I feel like music is very linked to people. For me, I will hear a song and have it remind me of a person from years ago that I haven't spoken to, or and didn't know that I associated that song with, because I maybe hadn't heard it since I'd seen them. But it's very powerful in the same way that scent is, or the visuals can be. I think it's something external can be so internal.
Yeah. So no, exactly that episodic memory being triggered is like Patrick Justlin spells out like 7 mechanisms of music and emotion, some of them being the involuntary, like the brainstem reflex, us jumping to those, again, involuntary episodic memory, like Pavlovian conditioning. We have an idea like, oh, this is our song, this is our wedding song, or this is our first date song, that kind of thing.
It's just like when you're saying about the alarms, that is the same. You're triggered to think, what's going on. It's just the way that, when you're listening to the sound. Yeah,
you were wondering if people felt judged, and I was very surprised that they went into that much depth. So maybe they felt like they weren't going to be judged, or because it was more of a data gathering experiment, and it was all anonymized, of course, and they were never going to meet me again if they didn't want to.
And presumably they had a lot of that experience alone, rather than sitting in a room with somebody, because they're standing surrounded by the speaker array that you've put together. So that person essentially is although they know you're there, obviously, they're alone in that room experiencing that emotion that you triggered for them, or that they've triggered for themselves, rather than being led there by the hand, I suppose.
Yeah, so weirdly, creepily, I had to sit right behind them or to the side of them, because I was making sure that the physiological data wasn't crashing and it was being recorded properly, and that was only had a little wire from their hands to my computer, my laptop. So they knew I was sitting right there, but I wasn't sitting with them, if that makes. I wasn't sitting beside them and being like, good, bad.
And how does that make you feel?
Be a bit removed. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that they then chose to speak about those things afterwards. It's, they might not have spoken about in a talking therapy, but afterwards it almost opened this door to them wanting to tell you, despite, this reminded me of this, and it just seems it just unlocks something.
Yeah, and if they weren't wanting to just speak verbally about it, then it was quite rare. I think there was one or two people that just sort of circled all the numbers on the Likert scales, for example, and then said, well, it didn't necessarily have a trigger sound, because they might not have. Like, there's one in particular that just felt no anxiety at all. That they were just
very lucky.
Messing with my data. They were very robust, apparently. But so I think it's quite similar, actually, when you're saying, is there any way I apply what I've learned in my practice to teaching? And I think it's really important, especially with online teaching now, to let students write a response, 100 words, for example, to some of the reading, some of the lecture stuff, and they share that on a wee website that we make for them, and they can opt into whether they contribute in the discussion, because for some students it's just too scary to speak out loud, even in a group of 10. So
I think that the other really interesting thing that you touched on when you were talking through the process there was catharsis. And that idea of, I know you spoke in your TED Talk about distraction versus processing, and how that kind of comes in. And I think that's a really interesting topic that maybe the average teacher wouldn't have thought about as well. That idea of you reaching catharsis rather than happily distracting away from something.
Yeah, no, I think that's something I came across in my research of the field before I would make my own work during the PhD, that like Patrick Juslin's mechanisms for emotional responses to music, there's also some more practical applications of music, like Sarah Kallio's using of music for mood regulation, all of these different strategies that can be used, like.
And I'm sure that's something that teachers do. I do that. I definitely do that, where I regulate my mood with music all the time. I'm never not listening to music. So that's something they must do for sure.
Yeah, and one of those is distraction. Another one that's maybe more linked to my research is, as Sarah Kallio called it, discharge, maybe purging, catharsis, release is maybe a nicer way of putting it than mood discharge or emotional discharge. But she would say distraction, discharge, energizing. There were 4 more. I can't remember those right now, but there, of course, sometimes we deliberately think, after a breakup, for example, you put on maybe Radiohead or Beyonce's Lemonade because you want to feel all the feelings. You want to have a cry, and that's a choice. Or there's maybe like that amazing scene in Father Ted where one of the priests goes away. Father Ted's just cheered him up for a week-long stay, but as soon as he gets on the bus, there's the playing of Radiohead, and it's like that. You were talking about the the difference between using sound for distraction or for catharsis. And I was aware that, like, I've tried meditation apps on my phone, or like I've tried listening to calming music at times when I'm feeling anxious, but I have found that it's like, okay, that's calmed me down for just now, but I know that maybe the more useful thing to do would be to actually feel the difficult feelings so I can move on from those, rather than constantly just trying to cheer myself up. But of course, during lockdown, I'm sure lots of people have just needed to try and maintain like some kind of optimism and cheeriness, and maybe this kind of emotional immersion in distressing sounds is maybe even more challenging at the moment. I know I'm certainly always got some kind of like chipper voice on the radio or comedy show on Netflix in the background at the moment. So I mean, I'm guilty of it too, like just distracting myself from difficult emotions. But you know, it's up to the user to try and figure out which methods are most appropriate.
Yes, I think it's just that, you know, sometimes when everyone's around you telling you should just be happy, it's really easy to do the distraction thing. And I think for someone working in a school, especially with teenagers or preteens, that's it's just a really interesting point of view that actually there's nothing wrong with feeling the feeling and processing the feeling, and not just cheering yourself up, because you know that processing is important too. Otherwise, you're carrying it around with you, aren't you?
I mean, it doesn't feel like a coincidence that a lot of us, when we were young teenagers, loved Avril Lavigne or Linkin Park or My Chemical Romance. So, you know, there's a reason that...
Absolutely naming my teenage years. I mean...
So, you know, it can be really helpful for teenagers. I know there was a lot of demonizing of some of this, like, was it new metal or Marilyn Manson, that kind of metal music, and of course there are some like ethical arguments to do with certain song lyrics and perpetuation of like hyper masculine ideals, that kind of thing. But at the same time, like, it can be helpful for, well, I've had a student recently in the last couple of years make a master's dissertation all about how playing in his black metal band allows him to have emotional catharsis. And you know, it is being studied as well that these kind of loud shouty
screamo type
music can be profound for helping people understand what they're feeling.
Yeah, and I guess it's, you know, it's maybe slightly less mainstream, but it is no different than watching a sad film when you're sad. It's you know, it's the same process, isn't it? It's, you know, internally.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I've read about, I didn't monitor this in my experiment, but I've read about this neurochemical called prolactin, which it's a soothing neurochemical that's actually meant to be like an analgesic or a painkiller. So whenever we're hurt physically, our brain sets off prolactin. But this prolactin's also elicited, apparently, when we listen to sad music or power ballads or watch a tearjerker film. Like, there's a reason that we get a bit of a thrill sometimes from watching or listening to these sad stories.
Yes.
Very interesting. Well, it's been lovely to talk to you and to get to know a little bit more.
Talking to you too.
A little bit more to, you know, to see what it is that you do and what your background is. And I think it's just really interesting for, you know, anyone working at any level of education, not necessarily to be putting into practice the things that you do, but just to be aware of them and of, you know, the fact that they are out there as theories, as modules of dealing with things. I think it's just really interesting and powerful to talk about those things, because it brings in so many other things, like we were talking about earlier, where you can, you know, use those techniques to go out and take a class around, to listen to the sounds around them, and to open discussions. And it's been great to hear all about it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody. And if there's one thing that we've taken away from Jess's podcast, it's to tune in and not to tune out.
See you next time.